What's going on, my friends? In this video, I'm going to show you guys a Sierra chart custom study that I made, which is pretty interesting. It's a bit of an experiment. And what this study does, let's go over to the screen right now. It keeps track of every single update that is made on the order book for a futures contract. In order for this to work, you need something called market depth data or level 2 data. And more specifically, in order to display it historically like this as a graph, you actually need the historical market depth data in a file where you can read it. And what's really interesting is that Sierra chart has this data. You can download what's called historical market depth data files. And what I'm doing here, in this case, I'll explain to you what exactly you're looking at on this graph. It's reading through every single change that is being made to a bid or an ask on the order book. And the number of levels of the order book is set based on the number of levels you set in the chart. And every single time there's a change to one of the bid levels, it creates a +1 to my counter. Every time there's an activity on the offer, it does a -1 to my counter. So what it really results in is whenever there's more activity on the bid, you're going to see a graph that goes higher. Whenever there's more activity on the ask, you're going to see the graph go lower. So what we're seeing here is an example of more activity on the bid, and that's the actual price of what the market did. Now, this is just an experiment. I do not know if this information means anything. I'll explain to you why I think this study is an interesting idea. It's because the markets are pretty much run on arbitrage. And what that means is you have big institutional market making firms that their job is to provide bids and offers for a market. And all these markets are pretty much interlinked. They're interlinked to whatever the spot prices are. And the futures order book is changed based on what the market makers' arbitrage algorithms are saying. So they need to adjust their bids and offers. So what this study shows is the activity taking place on the bid and on the offer, and it's recording that to a readable price graph so you can see if there's more activity on the bid or more activity on the offer for a particular time period, and you can track the trends in this behavior and analyze this on a historical graph as well. And what I'm seeing is that there's actual consistent trends with this. There's consistent trends where there's a lot more activity on the offer than on the bid. And what I'm interested in observing is what the price did during that time, and then potentially collecting some of that data and observing any anomalies there. I just find it interesting because I think that the futures markets are pretty much run entirely on arbitrage. And, when the market makers adjust their bids and offers, we want to be seeing that. Normally, when you look at an order book, you don't see that information because you can't read with the human eye what's happening at every single depth level. You can't memorize the number of changes taking place at every depth level, how many times the bids and offers are being pulled and stacked, and overall how much activity is taking place. So you can see I have a whole graph here, and the way I was able to do this was by reading something that Sierra chart provides called historical market depth data files. Now, in this video, I'm going to show you how I built this study, and be grateful that I'm showing you at least this, is how to obtain the real-time changes to the order book and plot that to a real-time calculation number, okay? Because that's originally how I started building this study. I started by obtaining the real-time changes to the order book and created a calculation using that. And once I got that nice and solid and steady, I started working a bit on obtaining the historical market depth updates. So I just want to be clear is that I'm not going to show you how to get the whole price graph for all the historical levels. But for those of you that do stay around and you're genuinely interested in this, I'm going to show you how I built an advanced custom study from start to finish. So stick around, okay? I have it all on recording as well, and it's in this file right here. So let's go over to this video file that was recorded on August 15th, 2024. And This video file demonstrates me building an advanced custom study pretty much from start to finish, debugging it, showing all the process for setting it up for the most part, okay? So if I go over to the beginning of this file, you can see that I'm working on a new study function here, and the study is called Draw Order Book Activity. So I have a basic skeleton for the study. And what's important to know is that when you're building a study, you have to do some work in the sc.defaults code block. This code block is triggered whenever you add the study to your chart for the first time. And there's also a few other circumstances where this block gets triggered, and refer to the documentation to know that. So there's a few items that I added in here. Now, if you don't know how a CR chart study function works, I would recommend you to go look at their documentation and of course go into your CR chart installation folder, ACS source folder, and then examine some of the C++ files you can find here, because those show examples of some of the existing studies in CR chart and all the code that makes them work, basically. So if you just need a basic study function example, you can select this file, example customstudies.cpp, and it'll give you a basic skeleton for what a function looks like. There's a few different ones here, okay? So back to my video, you can see here that I have a few study inputs that I added. And I also want to say that at the time that I'm recording this, probably I have changed some of these things. And some of these features, I kind of write them in the moment. It's kind of like I'm spewing the paint on the canvas, and then later on I go and edit certain things and remove certain things and deprecate certain functionality that I thought of in the moment, but I realized I didn't actually need it, okay? So I just want to be clear that everything you're seeing me do here, some of it probably is not even there anymore. It's been removed or changed. But some things are still there. So you can see I have a few study inputs. And then I have the sc.setDefaults block here. I gave the study a name. sc.uses market depth data is very important. It needs to be set to 1. And then also if you're using historical market depth data, there's another flag that you need to set to true, which is, I think it's called sc.maintain historical market depth data, or maintain depth data for chart. I'm not exactly sure what it's called, but I'm using that one too now. Okay, the sc.value format, in this case I set it to base graph value format, but I actually ended up changing this to a different number when I realized that the number I wanted to display was actually just an integer value, and I didn't want it to be associated with the base graph value format, because in the example where I'm testing this on US Treasuries, the base graph value format is in fractional price display. So I don't want my value, in this case, I want it to display my value as a plain integer, rather than basing it on the graph value of the chart. So I ended up changing that. I always use manual looping for my studies, so I set auto loop to 0, and the graph region, I think I ended up changing that to 1. Okay, so we'll go through this, and I'll just kind of fast forward through this. I'm just writing some code here and giving the study a basic skeleton. So all I have at this point is the set defaults block. I don't have any additional code. So the study doesn't do anything. It's just, I'm just giving it some basic default configurations, okay? Now, every now and then I go into some of my other custom studies and I borrow code from there, because a lot of the stuff I've already written before, and I don't just know how to type it all by hand every time, by heart, I mean. So sometimes I'll go in and borrow code, like settings that I've used for subgraphs, and copy and paste it into the new studies I'm working on, okay? So I'm working on setting the subgraph settings as well as the input settings, making sure I have it set to manual loop, and then I open my virtual machine, which is what I'm using to compile the study, because, I mean, maybe this is not that important, but I am on Linux, and I don't use a cross compiler to build the study. I also don't use the CR chart remote builder to build the studies, even though I could with this one, because it doesn't have any additional dependencies. But the way I build my studies is using a virtual machine and a local compiler there. So what you're going to see me do here is log into the virtual machine, and I think I went to adjust the build script really quickly, even though I did have a shortcut for it on the desktop. I don't know why I was doing that. But yeah, I went to adjust the build script to put it into debug mode so it compiles a little bit faster, and then I go ahead and type in one command and it builds the study. Now normally, this is actually quite a lot faster than remote building. I just find it faster. But typically my compiling takes maybe 2 seconds or 3 seconds, whereas with the remote builder it might take 5 or 10 seconds in some cases. So I built the study, then I'm going ahead and adding it to my chart, and the study doesn't do anything yet. And what I noticed right away is that if you look at it added a chart region at the bottom of my chart here, and right away I noticed that the value format was incorrect because I already have it in my mind that I want to display a counter, which is displaying the sum of the activities happening on the order book. If it's a bid activity, it's +1. If it's an offer activity, it's -1. So I changed the value format to 1, compiled it again, and then you can see the value format changed at the bottom there. As you can see, I am referring to Sierra Chart documentation for what these things do, to sierrachart.com, documentation, table of contents, advanced custom study system interface and language, and then I'm here. Functions, variables, input array, subgraph array, working with date time, and other things like that, okay? So we'll keep going here. So this is where I think I start working on the actual code. And I went over to another study that Frozen Tundra helped me build some time ago. It must have been at least, could even be almost 3 years ago at this point. So I borrowed some code from this study that I still use, and it's interesting. It's an interesting study because this study obtains all of the market depth levels, quantities, and it saves them to an array, and then it reads from that array and performs calculations on that array. So I used some similar code. I borrowed some code from that, whereas you can see here we have pointers to dynamically allocated arrays. So sc.getPersistentPointer, what those are basically arrays. So we're creating various arrays to store information from the order book. And we're storing it in the correct type, which is a float. So I grabbed some of that code, copy and pasted it to my study function. So I'll just fast forward a little bit until I get to that point, because there is a lot of me just analyzing the code and thinking about the code and making sure I know exactly what it's doing. So I'm going to skip past that. I was reading a bit about how persistent variable functions work. Sometimes it's good to get a bit of a refresher there. Doing some research. And then I finally started to copy paste some variables into the study. So creating pointers for our levels, and one mistake that I did here was actually changed the type to integer, which is incorrect because the quantities that you obtain from the market depth object, which is this one right here, s_market depth entry, the quantities that you obtain from that are actually of the type float. Just ignore the fact that I made those integers because they're supposed to be floats. Then in the last call to the function, which is important, I should iterate this here, I should talk about this. So whenever the study's closed or Sierra Chart's closed, it triggers this code block. So any memory that needs to be freed is going to be done here, or any kind of cleanup behavior. You have to put it in this block right here, sc.LastCallToFunction. So in this case, we have sc.freeMemory, and we're freeing those arrays. With this sc.getPersistentPointer, we actually allocate memory. Now, I'm not 100% sure if we need to allocate memory for those pointers or not, but I just left it there just to be consistent. So now we start with some of the code for grabbing the market depth data, and I just want to be clear that this is to obtain real-time changes to the order book. Anytime there is a change to the order book, it's going to process those changes and create basically a counter that keeps track of the events taking place. So it's going to save in memory whatever the previous quantity was, and it's going to check that quantity against the current quantity or the new quantity that it's obtaining. And if it's different, then it'll record a change. Okay, and that's going to go for the number of levels that you decide to show on your chart, which is controlled in various places. The first place that it's controlled is in global settings, Sierra Chart server settings. So this is where you actually limit the number of depth levels that you can even get from Sierra Chart. So I set 40 in that case, but you can limit it further. And yeah, and the function right here, sc.getMaximumMarketDepth levels, returns an integer, and the integer that it returns is the number of depth levels that are showing on your chart. And the way you get that is by going to chart settings, market depth, and then right here, maximum market depth level. So when you change this, that's the number that gets returned by that function. So I just changed it to 20. And I know that because I checked it multiple times already. As you can see here, here's an example of me putting in some code to check the value of the array element 0. And this is something that I want you guys to pretty much get used to seeing, because every single value that I pull out of Sierra chart, I'm always checking what it is before I do anything with it. When in doubt, print shit out. Thanks to Frozen Tundra for that. He probably got it from someone too. But that's the golden advice, I would say, for debugging any kind of information in simple study functions like this. Again, I'm going back and forth between the studies to examine exactly what I'm doing. I'm building the study just to look. I forgot that I needed a message object, so I put it in at the top. And then I decided that I wanted to create two code blocks, one for the initial call to the function when the arrays are still empty, and then the subsequent calls to the function of when the arrays are not empty, it's going to do a different behavior. Now, I'm not sure if I may have removed that afterwards. It was just mostly for debugging and testing, but that's how I set that up. So I said, if the bid quantities array element 0 is equal to 0, meaning the first element in the array is 0 for both of them, I wanted to do a certain behavior here. Else, if they're not 0, if they've already been set, then do this behavior here. Okay, now this is code here to iterate over the levels on the book. This is obtained directly from a Sierra chart example. You start off by creating an integer for the number of levels that are showing on the chart using the maximum market depth levels variable that I created earlier. And it's using another variation of this function, which is get bid market depth number of levels, or get ask market depth number of levels. And it's iterating over those levels and then doing certain behaviors here. Okay, so I pretty much put together the entire syntax for that, for the initial call to the function. So you can see we create the market depth object. So we call this function to get the bid market depth entry at level and get the ask market depth entry at level using the depth entry object and the level that we're passing in using our array here. So we start at 0 and then we iterate over bid array levels. And then we save the quantities to that array, the one that we dynamically allocated. And we're saving the quantity specifically here, depth entry.quantity. Okay. Now, you can always refer to exactly what is in these structures just by referring to the Sierra chart code. So that one is called s_market depth entry. The way you would find that is by going into your Sierra chart ACS source folder, going into one of their header files. It would be sc.structures.h. So in this case, the market depth entry structure is actually an sc.constants.h. So you can see here, that's what this structure looks like. That's what the structure provides. So you access, so you can access all these members of it. Going back to it, I then added a print statement because I wanted to make sure that this was only going to be called one time, because once our array element zeros have been set, then it should not call that behavior anymore. And we get one call to it, and that's it. There's a new function or a new feature in Sierra chart that shows when you have repeated messages in the message log, rather than printing them out over and over again, it just tells you the number of times that it was added. So since there's no number there, it means that it was only printed once, which is exactly what I was looking to do. So then I go ahead and copy the same code into the subsequent calls. So what I added in the subsequent calls is here is check the quantity at the price versus what was previously saved at this price. So depth entry.quantity is not equal to p_bid quantities at our current level, and we're iterating through the bid levels and the ask levels. So if there's been a change at this market depth level, append to the counter in the case of a bid change, and decrement from the counter in the case of an ask change. And my counter was actually returning a 0 for a while, not realizing that the reason was because my pointers were set to integers when they had to be float. which is the correct type for the quantity, and then I change them there. So I create a persistent variable of type integer called Orderbook event counter. And the reason why this needs to be persistent is because it needs to be remembered between calls to the study function, or else it would just be reset every single time. Because remember, this code is being triggered. This study function is being called every single time the chart updates. So if I have a fresh value every time, it'll just override it with a 0. Whereas we need to be remembering what our order book event counter is, especially for the real-time data. So I use a persistent variable for that. Added a reset for that variable just as a precaution in the last call to function. And then I added this functionality just as a test. Well, I just wanted to see if it would be of value at all, but I put an advanced custom study button in the study that can reset the counter back to 0 whenever the button is pressed. So I just went and grabbed some code for handling an advanced custom study button press. Inside the code for when the user pressed the reset button, reset our value to 0. And then I was writing to do clear out any historical values we might be maintaining in a subgraph array. So I think that was pretty easy to do anyways. So then I add a debug statement for the order book counter. And then I got an unhandled exception in Sierra chart. I'm not exactly sure why, but we're getting a print value of 0. I wasn't exactly sure why I was getting that 0, but let's see what I did to change that. And what I realized is that I was missing a return on the sc.LastCallToFunction, because what was happening in this case is because there was no return in the sc.LastCallToFunction, it was triggering it and it was continuing to trigger the rest of the study function as well, which was allocating the memory for pointers that we don't need. So it was causing some kind of a memory corruption or something. So it's very important that we return the study function on the last call to function, or else it'll continue to trigger the function, which is not what we want to do when we're closing the study. That was what was causing Sierra chart to crash every time I took the study off the chart. So I reloaded Sierra chart now and we're not crashing. Our value though of our counter is still 0, so we need to solve this. So let's see what I did to solve it. So I put in a message.format to debug the array level and debug the quantities, just to see if we're actually getting anything, you know, because you never know. We might be there might be some kind of a syntax error in our code that's not allowing it to get the error. So when in doubt, print it out. So we can see there the level's getting printed here. We're getting debugging the quantities and all that. And what I think I'm seeing is that we're not really seeing any changes that are being made to the quantities. They always look the same. So as you can see, I'm checking p_bid quantities level against depth entry.quantity, and that's before I'm changing it to the new value. And really what it should be is it should be different, because these, well, not all of them will be different, but some of them should be different because the quantity, that depth entry is always changing. So there's an issue in our code here. We need to determine what that problem was. And now I'm adding a print statement inside the block that checks if depth entry quantity currently is not equal to what we have saved in the array at the same level. And we're still getting value 0, but I'm getting more information about my study function as we go on with this. And then what I think I realized the problem was is that I was trying to print out a float with the values in integer. So there's an example of a very stupid error, printing it out as a float, but it is an integer that was resulting in it being 0, because then I compiled it and now I'm getting a value. So now our counters come to life. We're starting to get values come out of our counter here. So for every time there's a bid change, it's a +1. Every time there's an ask change, it's a -1. So you can see in this case, we have more ask activity than bid activity since we started at 0. That's all good. That's all fine and dandy. Now, what I think I started working on at this point is I put in whatever the keyboard shortcut was for the custom study button to reset the number. And then I pressed the button there just to show you that I could reset it back to 0 using the advanced custom study button. I think I set it to something like Shift D or Control D. So, you know, just to show that you can do that. It's just for debugging. It's good to be able to use an advanced custom study button to help you do certain things. I use them for a variety of things. And now I start working on writing our values into a subgraph array so that way we can read it in a human readable format. I start working on that, and I'm starting to configure the subgraph, and I guess I spent a lot of time doing this, so I'll skip past most of that. But basically what I wanted to do was make it look pretty much identical to the ask bid volume difference study in Sierra chart, which basically looks like this. It's basically chart bars like that for whatever the value is that you're printing. And they're full chart bars that have a high, low, open, and close. Even though these ones some of them look like they don't, but they do in this case. Because it clearly shows you, where the bar opened, where the bar closed, and the high and the low of the bars. So I'm just tinkering around with the subgraph settings, trying to get something to display, and then I finally got something to display here, although it doesn't look that good. And then I just go one thing to the next, and I think I just ended up copying the code directly from the ask bid volume difference study, the subgraph settings that is, and then this logic right here computes the open, high, low, and close values. Actually, specifically, this is for the high, and this is for the low. This is for the close. And you can see I'm only setting SC array size -1, which is the last bar on the chart. I'm not writing to any other bars in the chart, just the array size -1. The historical values, I've already done that, but that's part of the, the more advanced version of the study, I guess. So I'm still not getting it to print correctly here. I mean, the value, my counter is good and everything, but the way it's displaying is incorrect. So I continue to tinker along with this subgraph, with the subgraph settings here. And then I'm examining some code from the bid-ask volume difference study, putting some of that in my study to see if I can get it to look similar. So yeah, as you can see here, I'm tweaking the subgraph settings here for the line label, name label, value label here. And I have draw 0 set to 2, which I think I ended up turning that off now. Playing around with the color settings a little bit, it still doesn't look correct. And then what I ended up changing at the end of this was this. So you can see here I have if subgraph high at the last bar index is less than Orderbook event counter, then the subgraph high at the last bar index will be equal to the Orderbook event counter. So that sets the high, but what I was missing here is that, or if the subgraph high at SC array size -1 is equal to 0. So I was not handling 0 values, because as you can see here, the highs and the lows are always 0. So if we have a value greater than 0, the low is always going to be 0. If we have a value lower than 0, the high is always going to be 0. So I had to add that bit of logic in, and it fixed it. And I basically wrote a to-do at the end of that video to fix that. So I'll go to the next video. And by the time I was in the next video, you can see I added that logic in, and you can see that our chart bars are starting to look readable and normal. But you can see here overall that our bars are looking readable. So there's an example of what that data looks like over a certain number of bars. I think these are probably 1-minute bars, and I'm running a chart replay here just to show how that data works along with the actual, what the market is doing. And I think it's very interesting. Like I showed you guys here, I have it now so that I have all the historical data loading in beforehand, and as you can see, it creates a counter with a pretty large value, because we have data that's being loaded on this chart from a number of days in the past. So the counter continues to increment, so it results in pretty high numbers or pretty low numbers. In this case, the counter is in negative 800,000 or something. But what I'm more interested in observing is the changes that are being made to this. And what I'm seeing is that there's actual consistent trends with this. There's consistent trends where there's a lot more activity on the offer than on the bid. And what I'm interested in observing is what the price did during that time, and then potentially collecting some of that data and observing any anomalies there. I just find it interesting because I think that the futures markets are pretty much run entirely on arbitrage. And when the market makers adjust their bids and offers, we want to be seeing that. Normally, when you look at an order book, you don't see that information because you can't read with the human eye what's happening at every single depth level. You can't memorize the number of changes taking place at every depth level, how many times the bids and offers are being pulled and stacked, and overall how much activity is taking place. Anyways, if you guys have any ideas for me regarding this study, please share. You can email me at support@VerrilloTrading.com, and maybe I'll let you beta test this study. Why not? And until then, I will see you guys in the next video. I will post a source code example of the code that I showed in this video. It's going to be a very basic version of my study. It's not going to be the full thing, unfortunately. But if you guys like this, send me a message, comment on the video. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.